Did you both have a chance to look at the minutes from last meeting?
Yeah. It's already a little while ago. They looked very good and thorough to me, but
Okay.
I don't have more feedback for now.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm more worried about if
Same for me.
I missed anything.
Oh, Michael is here, huh? Cool.
Hi, Michael.
Hey, Michael, welcome.
Hi.
Okay, we were just going over the meeting minutes from the last meeting. You weren't here. Did you get a chance to look at the meeting minutes?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, wonderful. So you're up to speed on where we're going. Did you have any questions about that?
Not really. Just keeping track.
Good. Let's press forward then. During the last 2 weeks, there's been discussion on the mailing list about where to store the project work, GitHub versus GitLab, or somewhere else. Should we try and get a server that's hosted, such as at my university, or directly by the R consortium, or something like that? I have a preference for GitHub because it's simple. It does support the R community and the open source community. Martin, you were the one who had a differing opinion about using a GitLab instance or a GitLab the website with their hosting. So do you have comments on your preferences?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said everything that I wanted to say. It was interesting for me to read what I just didn't know, the comment of Jim Hester on the mailing list, where he said that the API of GitHub allows you to also get a handle on all your issues and other social data, so to speak, which is not part of the Git repository. And I kind of assumed that this was possible, but didn't know, and so now I know. So in principle, you can back up the full GitHub website, so to speak, concerning your project, as opposed to just the Git repos, which of course you always have. And so that was at least a little consolation, given all the others that think, well, since GitHub is used by so many people, we should use it as well. Because that's not always the best reason for me, particularly because I'm a very strong free software open source advocate. But I mean, honestly, this is a small project in the end, or medium-sized project, well, small project in the end compared to all the other projects. So the decision is not so important to me.
Okay. Carol, do you have any comments on using GitHub versus a GitLab instance or GitLab.com?
I think we might see that in 5 years, GitLab.com replaces GitHub. But until that, probably we should be using what's most convenient.
Okay. Michael?
And that to me, this appears to be GitHub.
So what exactly are we going to use the system for? Is it the code? Is it the wiki? Is it the issue? What is the main use case?
Yes.
Okay.
So any code that we develop will be stored there. It will be the it will be the sort of permanent repository for meeting minutes and planning documents, so that everything's in the open world, and we're completely transparent about how we're doing everything and how we're planning things. Wiki will be used for planning and documentation outside of what would be in code. So for example, the code planning of what classes we're going to use, how we're going to structure the classes, and how we're going to design that abstraction around the documentation, will likely start in a wiki that will then be eventually translated into code, which would be the final form.
Sure. Of course. So what is the R consortium say? I mean, obviously this is a official R consortium working group. So I know that the other working group I'm involved with, the one, they encouraged us to put the meeting minutes anyway on their wiki. So they have their own wiki for these working groups, and so we put the minutes there. And one would assume that they want some formal way of tracking, the output of these groups, and that it should be relatively consistent across groups. I realize there's not much of a precedent that's been established so far because we're sort of like the third group, or one of the first groups. So I guess it's still sort of to be set out, but maybe we should at least ask the infrastructure committee or whoever's approving these working groups that what their preferences are, because this really sort of belongs to them. The output of this group belongs to them, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So when you look at the R consortium webpage, we're not even listed in the IC working groups.
Right.
Well, yeah, it's not quite up to date yet.
Yeah, maybe not.
Okay, I wasn't sure if the R consortium had those resources already set up or not. But
I do know that they have a GitHub. Yeah, sorry, they do have some sort of a GitHub organization. The R consortium does, and I think that we had even at least entertained putting design documents and such up under a repository for that distributed computing working group. So that might actually be what they're endorsing. Again, I'm not totally sure, but it does seem like they have a presence on GitHub.
Okay.
This may be the advantage that the repository is actually private, and so we can publish parts of it once it's ready. Don't have to care about whatever.
Okay, that's a thought. So
I assume they're private because we don't know about it, right? So
yeah, if they have one, and it's certainly not well publicized, if it's intended to be publicized at all.
I think there's a lot about the R consortium that isn't well publicized, so they could work on that in general.
Yeah, we'll cut them some slack. They're not that old, so if they're, I think we all can agree that if the R consortium has these tools that they want us to use, we should use them. Any objections to that? Okay. If there is if they don't have a preference for us using their resources, or they don't have all the resources we would like, any firm objections to using GitHub? Okay. For now, we will use GitHub until I get word from the R consortium and the infrastructure steering committee. If they have those resources, we will move to the R consortium infrastructure if they have it and want to make it available to us. Along with that, is the discussion of how we're going to use the wiki versus Google Docs. The Google Docs is wonderful for live editing, for slower editing, for things such as the wiki, the list of documentation objects and stuff like that, that's going to be more permanent and not need to be edited in real time and then stored permanently. Should we be using the wiki? Should we have a Google Docs for kind of the slower edited, and assuming that will be on the R Consortium with their GitLab wiki or whatever they have available to us? Thoughts?
Sorry, I was just busy looking up the R Consortium wiki. Let me see if I can. Oh, I'm pretty sure I can post the link there. So they do have a wiki, and I think it's pretty easy to get access there. So what we could use the wiki for is, instead of the GitHub wiki, and to post the minutes at the very least. If this is what they're encouraging us to do anyway.
Okay.
And I haven't found the GitHub organization, the R Consortium. Probably there is one.
Okay.
Let me guess.
I'm assuming that what they have is a instance of GitLab operating on one of their servers that we would have access to. That's what I'm assuming it is. Michael, have you had any experience with that?
No, I don't think the R Consortium has any GitLab instances running.
Okay.
It's purely, I think they're on GitHub. I think that's what they're doing. So.
They are, and by an obvious handle. There you go. But it's a bit empty currently.
A wish list. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If the R Consortium is operating off of GitHub, then let's stick with GitHub. I will double check that they don't have a GitLab instance running. If they do, we'll move to that. If they want us to. Otherwise, we'll stay on GitHub.
Okay.
Hi, Sarah. You joined? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, today is full of meetings.
Okay, so back to the question of wiki, Google Docs, that discussion. Are we all okay using a wiki, whether that's on GitHub or our consortium GitLab instance? Or do we need to have the live editing capabilities of a Google Doc? And you can see below what that would be.
I have no strong feelings.
No strong feelings. Okay, we'll use the Google Doc today. Otherwise, I will translate this back onto the wiki, and that will be our standard working place is on the wiki.
So live editing for the minutes is actually a good thing. I'm rather enjoying it.
Yes, we will keep that.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, good. And we'll keep it, and then it will be translated onto the permanent storage for on the repository for the minutes.
Okay, thanks.
We'll keep it there, but we'll keep it live editing until we are at the end of the meeting. We'll finalize it and put it in. Okay. Okay, so the last thing. Carol, you wanted to talk about Slack, about using Slack.
Not,
Tell us about it.
This would be another option if we need it. If not, it's just another tool we could as well avoid using.
Okay, it looks to me like a souped-up mailing list kind of tool. I haven't used it, so is that essentially what it is?
I have no idea.
Okay.
But it came up on the mailing list, so I wanted to pick that up.
Okay, let's stick with the open source, with the mailing list. It's simple. We'll stick with the GitHub, the wiki, and the mailing list as our main locations.
Slack is a real-time chat system. It lets you post files as well.
Oh, okay. You've used it then?
Yes, extensively for all sorts of other projects.
Is it far superior to mailing lists and the tools that we have?
It depends on what you want. It's different because it can be real time, but you can also scroll back and see what people were talking about. It's a little more interactive than a mailing list, and not as rigorously time defined as having a Google Hangout. So.
Okay.
It's another option.
We'll keep it on. We'll keep it on the back burner if we decide that will be necessary to have that level of interaction and collaboration. We'll go there. For right now, let's put it off. Any objections? Okay. So the rest of the time that we've got is getting into the meat of what we're trying to do, of identifying objects that need documentation, the considerations for documentation. So we have. So I've got here a list of objects that need to be documented or need some sort of documentation about them. Considerations for classes. We have S4, S3, reference classes, R6 classes. There may be prototype classes that all need some sort of documentation, and how we're going to document an S4 class. How we document an S4 class will be different than a reference class and whatnot. And then we have elements of documentation, and this is the more single autonomous parts that would compose a documentation, but would be present in multiple documentation containers.
I thought about editing that and then wasn't entirely sure what you wanted, since that list doesn't include all of the things that are elements of the current documentation system, or all of the things that you list above as things you need to document for particular objects. So I was unsure whether you were trying to have a higher level of abstraction or what exactly was going on there. Okay,
so yes, I need more items on the list. I'm thinking of it as kind of if you think of documentation, for the basics of documentation is a list of elements that are the documentation. So a function documentation has a title, it has a description, it has details, it has an argument list. The argument list itself is a list of parameter information, or I'm sorry, argument information that is that has a description string about the argument and the name of the argument, the description of the argument, We can extend that to say for arguments, there can be acceptable classes, there can be acceptable bounds, there can be lengths, other things like that. So that would be elements of documentation that can be put in there, because what we're trying to do with this list is, can we identify all the things that need to be documented, how they relate to each other, so that we can decide how strict the documentation needs to be versus how flexible it would be, because that will influence what kind of class system we implement it in.
Andrew, may I remark what I wrote on the mailing list too, that there is a working group, not part of the consortium groups, about enhancing the R language with argument declaration stuff. And so I think it's a bit early to set up valid values for arguments and things like that, because that's not part of R now, and it may become. And then, well, anyway, it's good to keep this in mind, but I wouldn't emphasize so much, because if this would become part of R within a year, say, then that should rather be.
I agree.
It doesn't make sense if you have strict standards about documenting valid types and stuff of arguments, if this will be kind of counter to how the R language will do it in the future.
Yeah,
but
I agree with Martin. It'd be really hard to figure out, this whole sort of, a language for defining constraints and types, everything. It'd be totally redundant with what's going on in this other working group, and it's just kind of beyond the scope, a little bit too deep for this working group, I think.
Yeah, so
let me clarify. Let me clarify here. So you have a function that expects a S4 class object. You can document that. That doesn't necessarily say how you are going to create that documentation. Only that is something that you could document. If you absolutely had to have that documented, you would programmatically go in there and say the documentation for this object, go down into the parameter list, go down into the argument list, the argument, and then you say specify that class has to be this, that only accepts these classes. Just because the possibility exists to have that documentation doesn't necessarily dictate how that documentation is going to be created, nor does it say that documentation, it also doesn't say that documentation has to exist. So am I making sense here, Michael?
I don't know. He might start. I don't know.
So going back to the R users conference this summer, I saw at least 2 presentations on how to do argument checking for classes, for bounds, for those things. And I was sitting there thinking, I was already thinking about this documentation working group and saying, oh, well, what is an acceptable class to go into an argument? It is documentation. Having it in documentation that can then be used by another system that does the actual checking to say, okay, does this inherit from a character class, or does it inherit from a numeric class, or must it be an actual integer? Putting that in a documentation that can be said, that can be translated into, this must be a documentation. And then going back to Martin's point, that could either be used by the system to accelerate the byte compiler, or it could be a product of the byte compiler, that when the byte compiler says that, that's something that can be pulled out or inferred from the object that says, this is what it must be. Whether it's true. where that happens has yet to be determined.
Right. I mean, I think Martin and I are in agreement that, that the type declaration should be part of the language itself, not part of any sort of documentation language. I mean, it should be defined primarily in the language, where everything can make use of it, including the documentation system, including, static code analysis tools, and the R implementation itself. So I don't. So I kind of see this as, I don't know how it's going to come about. There's no firm plans on how we're going to implement these annotations in the language. I mean, how it's going to be extended to that. But and there may need to be some crosstalk between, because they're both annotations in a way, annotating with documentation, annotating with type information. One's more human readable, the other one's designed to be machine readable, potentially translatable into something human readable. But there may need to be some crosstalk there, and is there some generic mechanism for extending the language, like adding annotations on function arguments and things like that. But I think as it stands, we may not want to go too far down that road, at least not until this other working group makes some progress, and we can start a little bit of we can open up some communication with them. But as it stands, maybe just kind of saying, yes, we want to kind of think about supporting, think about having a formal mechanism for generating these type and other constraints, right, and rendering them in some consistent way, and like the renderer should be aware of it, et cetera, right? But we should kind of defer the actual design of that for now.
Okay. Let me give a concrete example that exists in R right now, to see if we can see something. So think about the function as data frame. So an S3 method that says I am an S3 method that only takes a matrix, or I take a let's take table. Table is one of them. So I specifically work on a table. It expects a table. The documentation that it is operating on a table exists right now in the function name for the S3 methods. That is a method of documentation, documenting the parameter. There are other attributes of arguments that, such as when you give a list of options, that's part of the language, but what those options are and what they do is part of what we should think about when we think about documentation. And designing a documentation system that says, yes, we can take that information, store it somewhere. I'm not trying to take over the working groups, trying to do typing for R. I'm only saying that that's a consideration. If we decide not to say that, not to say that that's going to be part of it, that's okay. It's just a consideration.
I think it's a valid point.
I'd like to try.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'd like to try to summarize what I understood here. We're looking for a way to specify argument types in the language itself, and we're looking for a way to document these specifications. Now, if there's a relation between these two, it only has to be one way. So we will never need to convert a specification in a documentation object to a machine readable thing. So, but what we need to ensure that when this becomes available, either via what the other working group figures out, or via other existing approaches, perhaps, that we need somehow we need a consistent way to convert these machine readable specifications into documentation. And so maybe what we need is some mechanism which might be usable in other applications as well, that allows to plug in an arbitrary object which then gets translated into human readable documentation with links, with markup, etc. So this is how I understand this discussion at this point. And we don't need to wait for anyone, really. We could just make this pluggable from the start.
Right. Thank you, Carol. We're discussing. We know that the working group is working on it. Therefore, it should be a consideration for getting that representing that in documentation, not specifying how that will be put into documentation yet, but knowing that it will come eventually. If it comes eventually, we have a way to handle it when it does come.
Right. It's a good point also that Crow brought up. I mean, the idea of, if you abstract how you get that type information, then you could, for example, right now make use of the existing knowledge that we have from the different method dispatch systems, right? And both S3 and S4 methods have, there is a formal notion of more formal in S4, but there is a formal notion of which types are in their signature, right? And so we have information already that could be extracted from those objects. And so if you have a way, just an abstraction that says, okay, here's a code object, I'm going to extract type information. When richer type information becomes available, it'll be able to make use of that.
Yeah.
So we could proceed that way.
Yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We are trying to define all the documentation needs without yet defining how that documentation will be created and specified, whether that comes from our Oxygen or RD format, or it's created specifically in code to assign each documentation element to its object or its list element or its slot. However we decide that's a future discussion, how that's going to be made when we discuss the class system and and the input and the output methods. Right now we're just trying to decide what we need to document, what needs to exist in documentation.
Right. Well, at that level, I can agree that we need to document the types.
Okay, good. That that's where we're at right now. So let's brainstorm a little bit. Sarah.
I was brainstorming already.
Just
the notes on the document.
Just go ahead and add them. So
I did.
What is a raster? What are you? I
So-
know raster.
It's a gridded spatial data.
Okay.
I was just suggesting that rather than saying we're going to document data frames, we should be talking about documenting data sets, of which a data frame is one kind.
Yeah.
Assuming that was what you meant by data frames.
I was intentionally data frames, but yes, data sets. I know that in Bioconductor there are annotated data frames which have variables plus a second data frame that has that contains the metadata about the variables in the first data frame. And I mean, you can.
Many data sets that are not data frames. I don't understand why you don't agree with that.
I'm sorry, what?
There are many data sets that are not data frames.
Oh, yes.
Right, that was my point.
I agree with the point that there are lots of data sets that are not data frames. Data frame is what I was thinking when I wrote that as a specific, this exists, this is concrete. I would like to get your guys' input on what other types of data sets need to be considered, and how we document those. What?
Well, I don't think we really need to list all the possibilities because there are so many possibilities. I think we should be considering the kinds of things that you want to know about a data set. What kind of R object is it? Is it a data frame? Is it a raster object? Is it one of these annotated data frames? Whatever. What's in it? Where did it come from? How do you cite it if you use it?
I would describe it as, what you have up above that is you have S3 classes, you have S4 classes, right? So you have these formal classes that have formally defined composition, but you also have these more general collections of objects that are sort of defined at the instance level, and there's no external definition of the structure of this object, which we would have in the case of a lot of biocomputer objects. We have very, very well defined and constrained compositions of objects. But there are cases where you have they're using a data frame, right? You just need an arbitrary list of columns or whatever, cells in the matrix or whatever. Those collections, that you should define the composition of those collections, whatever they are. You can call them data sets or whatever, but they're just instances of general containers that for whatever reason the function makes an assumption about what that composition is. Right.
Okay, I think you and I are thinking of entirely different things, because what I was thinking about was specific instances of some of those. Like, there are many packages out there that include data in them. I was thinking about documenting that.
Me too. Me too. And that's look at the standard R package data sets, which exists forever, and it has some time series and it has some other non-data frame data sets. So they are very, very simple compared to the things Michael was talking about.
Right. We don't need to say anything about what it is. We need to say that it's a data frame and then what's in it. We don't need to define data frame as part of this.
I thought we were still talking about the function arguments. What we make
okay.
types of stuff, yeah.
I think it would be useful to mandate to specify with each dataset a way how it can be viewed. So this is obvious for data frames, but might be not so obvious for other kinds of data. So it's not quite an example, but just maybe a different kind of section, how to view this thing, how to look at it. And from there, people can start exploring other options to work with the data. I think this would be useful.
I'm not quite clear on what you're meaning on how to view the object.
You get a package. You look at the help. You see that there is a raster object. You don't know what a raster object is. You don't know how to deal with it.
Oh, okay.
One obvious way would be to look at it. And I'm suggesting to provide a standard way to specify for the user how to look at the data, either by a summary or by some interactive viewer, or I don't know, whatever is most useful for this kind of data that's in there.
Okay.
Does that make any sense?
I think I can realize that datasets are going to be a part of this these generic type of objects that we have an object, we need documentation about it, which is fundamentally different than a defined class, a function, a method, a package, files, those things. Do we agree on that? So let me rephrase my question. Do we agree that data sets are going to be complicated?
I wouldn't think they should
How,
be
how
that.
much? Sorry.
Martin, let's hear from you first.
It depends on how much detail and detailed structure we really want the documentation to have to give. If I think about the current RD documentation, which seems about sufficient to me for data sets, then it's not such a complicated thing.
Mhm.
But maybe you really have different, or I think Kirill had different applications in mind, where the documentation would already kind of include on how to include the API to that data set, so to speak, and then it may be much more complicated.
Well, we can already have examples. I was suggesting just to have a dedicated one-liner how to look at the data. That gets you started, or gives a meaningful summary when executed. But
Okay.
not that important at all. I'm thinking about code books too.
So what okay, when we think about data sets, I like where Sarah was going with this, of the column and elements you want to know when you document a data set is, where did it come from? How do you cite it? What are the variables? I'd maybe say, what are the components of it? If that's so thinking annotated data frame, you have a data frame and you have a metadata, and then those have documentation, the metadata being actual documentation of the variables in a very specific, highly specified way. So those kind of elements can be generalized, and then it may be necessary to say, for each, we have a very flexible documentation structure that can document data that's just thrown together as a list. You could have a list of data frames and have a documentation for the whole list, plus documentation for each of the data frames. And such as that nature. So there's going to have to be some flexibility in how we define this documentation if we're allowing documentation of general objects. So let me pose that question. Do we want to be able to document anything? Is there value there?
Well, we need to be able to document things that we don't know about yet, because people invent new kinds of things for R all the time. So it can't be too rigid in terms of how we document it.
We should be able to attach a doc string to any object in R. And
Yeah.
if an object consists of multiple objects, then you should be able to attach a string to each of those component objects. And I don't think it gets too complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. So we should be able to, that's where I was thinking, is we should be able to be able to attach documentation to anything, or the documentation should be able to exist for anything. List, external pointer that has documentation about the function that it points to, or things like that, things that carry through. Even standalone documentation, which is essentially what a vignette is. It's a standalone documentation that has prose and code, input and output.
What happened?
So
Carol?
I'm wondering about how we should link the kind or the class of an object to the elements that would be required to document an object. And I was thinking along the lines of a template or something, that the package or yeah, let's stick with rasters, for example, which might have different documentation needs to other objects. The raster package could specify a template for a documentation object that all raster objects should have.
Yes. That we're getting. Go ahead, Sarah.
So something like a context-aware package skeleton function,
Yeah.
object skeleton.
If you want to put it that way, yes.
Mhm.
I was thinking of it in terms of something as a. We have a generic documentation object that is a documentation string. We have a documentation object for a function, and then there's different levels for that documentation. Such as if you want to create a documentation, you must have documentation string, and you must document the arguments. If you want to put it into a package, the package runs checks at an elevated level that would also say every argument must have a string. You must have a description as well. Maybe you have to have maybe it goes through and checks and says if you have an author, that author must be a person class. So the rigidity that we specify will become more and more rigid the more specialized the documentation becomes. Does that make sense? That's where I'm thinking. That's the direction I'm headed. Is to so when you have an S3 method documentation, that requires everything of the function documentation. Plus, it says I have to know what the generic is, what the maybe some other things that go along with that. Carol, does that help? We're a little bit jumping ahead with talking about how we're going to implement it. What we've discussed is documentation requirements will be different when they're created on the fly versus when they're put into a package. And for example, a working group could say this must be documented for every function that goes into our package or gets put into this repository, and they can check against it, even if that's more strict than what would naturally be required for a package. But there should be different levels of requirements of different levels of strictness, I guess.
Yeah, but this complicates things again. I'd just like to suggest as a thought experiment, treat functions as a special kind of data set.
Sorry, say that again?
Treat functions as a special kind of data set.
I don't follow how you get from a data set object to a function, because a function is. Please explain.
When designing these documentation objects, I don't think they should treat functions substantially different from other objects they're documenting. That's why I'm suggesting this. Put them in the same list and try to figure out an object structure that captures both. with checking mechanisms, as you mentioned, or templates, ways to specify a template, and so forth and so on. I think this might simplify the process in the end, and make it more robust as well.
Okay, I'm still having trouble following. I'm sorry. Maybe I need more caffeine. So
We're currently in this list in the minutes. We're distinguishing between functions and string classes and store classes and data sets with different kinds of data sets as a sub item.
yes.
Maybe another way to look at it, I mean, this is a list already, right? Just have a top-level bullet for each kind of data set would be probably the same thing. And then around this, there should be a common, very generic way to encode the documentation. But this is what you probably had in mind anyway. So.
Okay. I think we are on the same page. But you lost me where you said functions are a type of data set, or did I mishear that?
Yes.
Okay, I misheard that.
Was just transferring the list another way.
Okay.
Never mind.
Okay.
Just my point is, don't make too much of a distinction between the different object types there. They should be all the same to the documentation system anyway. That's what I probably meant.
Okay. Richard, welcome.
Thanks. My internet went out just as the meeting was supposed to start, so spent the next 40 minutes trying to get it back. So.
Okay, well, welcome. Do you have any comments on what we've been discussing so far? We're going through making sure that we have listed our considerations for documentation. That I will go and summarize. I'll take this, summarize it, and start to lay out a class hierarchy of documentations, and come back with some recommendations for next time of the considerations that we need for a class system, and then we'll discuss how this is going to start looking to implement into R, whether that's going to be S3 classes, S4 classes, reference classes, something along those lines.
Well, so I just got here, so just catching up. But so I see that you've got standalone documentation and various things like vignettes and examples and whatnot. But what about the things like existing help files that don't map to objects? Things like syntax and startup. Where do those go? And what are they?
Now, when you say syntax, you mean usage?
I don't know if R has one, but S Plus had a help file called syntax. And you could do, question mark syntax, and you'd get this thing that talked about basically the structure of the language, the overall structure of the language. And R has the startup help file that tells you exactly what happens when you start an R session.
Now, see, I would consider those to be independent or standalone documentation, because they don't tie to an object. Mm-hmm. They're just a piece of documentation. What you want to put in there, you can put in there.
Right.
And essentially it has a lot of the same elements that you would have in these other types of documentation. It just doesn't have to be tied to a
particular object. Yeah. Right.
And our goal is to make sure that as much of the original RD language is supported to translate into internal objects, so that any RD file can be read and translated into internal documentation that can then be translated or used
Okay.
however we need. So, good point. So I'm gonna put those as sub things here. Okay.
Guys, I have another meeting, so I'm gonna run.
Okay. We are up with our time. If anybody has any comments, I just kind of outlined what we will be doing over the next 2 weeks and coming back to discuss at the next meeting.
Okay.
Any final comments?
It'd be nice to have a calendar entry sent, like calendar invite sent out, so it just adds it to all of our calendars. We can keep track of what's going to happen.
I did send a calendar invite to the mailing list. If you did not get it, I will send it to you directly.
Okay, thanks.
So same for me.
Same for you? Okay. I will add. Everybody wants the separate calendar.
I've got it.
Okay.
I got it, but it didn't work apparently because it wasn't on my calendar for today. So
Okay.
just resend it to the list and we'll all try again.
I'll resend it to the list, add people individually, whatever you need. If it doesn't work for you, let me know.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye, everybody.